Good morning, everybody. I hope you are all doing well. I am recording this on April 14th, but it is for the Wednesday, April 15th class. We're getting close to the end. It's kind of crazy. And yet it's not, right? This is such a weird semester. But obviously, we're getting close to the end. We've just got, a little over 2 more weeks left at this point. So we're coming to the end, and we're in the 20th century. So I want to continue talking about where we were. Let me rephrase that. I want to continue talking from where we were the other day when we were talking about progressivism. And specifically today, I want to look at the progressivism that really becomes a form of nationalism, an extreme form of nationalism, with Teddy Roosevelt, and then this kind of international nationalism with Woodrow Wilson. I'm also hoping today, and I'm pretty sure we can. I want to also spend some time looking at William James and pragmatism. It's a lot to cover in our time period, but I think, especially given where we're at in the semester, that it's probably a good idea to do all of those. So, if you don't mind, and I could do my old joke, even if you do mind, right? I want us to turn to page 605 for the new nationalism and talk about Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was an absolutely fascinating figure in all kinds of ways. He was a president who became president initially after his president, because he was vice president, had been assassinated by a left-wing anarchist. And Teddy Roosevelt that is when he became president then, he had a really progressive pedigree and a really militaristic pedigree behind him, both when he had worked with the New York police as well as when he had served in the Spanish-American War. And he had a frontier background. He was a great writer. I mean, he was one of America's best writers, frankly, one of the best writers we've ever produced. He was amazing. But he was this very kind of fearsome figure, and he was a pretty hardcore nationalist. And one of the things that we haven't really talked about with the progressives is what they had in common, at least on a personal level. So it's pretty interesting to see that almost all the progressives of the time period 1890 to 1920, almost all of them had come of age. They had been very young men and had come of age during the American Civil War. And they had become convinced, not surprisingly, war does this all the time for generations. They had become convinced that most of the problems in the world could be solved if only we organized in a military fashion, just like Abraham Lincoln had organized the Union to stop the issue of slavery. So we can organize the Union in a similar kind of militaristic fashion to stop almost any problem. And we'll see that language, which enters into the American landscape, we'll see that throughout the 20th century, especially when we have things like the war on poverty, or the war later in the 21st century on terror. All of these things come out of that Civil War era, and that idea that if we could rally enough people, if we could get our citizens collectivized to such an extent, we could solve almost any problem. So number one, when we're thinking about these progressives, almost all of them came of age, young men who came of age around the time of the American Civil War, and their example of solving the problems of the Union were to militarize. That's pretty important. Number two, something that we often don't think about, but we should, especially given the religious history of America. The vast majority of the progressives were children of evangelical ministers, but they were children who had adopted social Darwinism as a scientific and social cultural philosophy, as opposed to the religion of their fathers. So they still have that evangelical fervor, that zeal, but they've transferred it from a love of Jesus to a love of Darwinian evolution. And that is also something that I think we have to take into account when we're talking about the progressives and this really interesting, I disagree with them in almost every way, but this extremely interesting generation or two of Americans who radically rechange the American landscape and do so in many ways because of their own change and understanding of science. But if we turn to page 605 and we look at Teddy Roosevelt here, he gives a speech, not surprisingly, at Osawatomie, Kansas. He gives it on August 31st of 1910, and he is addressing, there's a reason it's Osawatomie. This was one of the places that the Union kind of rallying point. He was a terrorist, but he was still a rallying myth, John Brown, where he had been really active in Osawatomie right before the Civil War. And of course, he was executed before the Civil War. But he had become this kind of symbol of the great abolitionist movement right before the Civil War. And he certainly was one of the reasons that the Civil War was fought, because the South, when they go to war against the North, have this kind of image. It's a mistaken image, but it's a powerful image nonetheless. They have this image of John Brown really representing all of the Northerners. And so Osawatomie is this symbolic place. And it's in Kansas, of course, where the Civil War really begins a few years earlier than the American Civil War because of all the terrorist activity between those people called the Jayhawkers and the Border Ruffians. So there had been a civil war going on, mostly around Kansas City, in 6 counties around Kansas City since about 1855, so really a full 6 years earlier before the American Civil War. So he's speaking here, Teddy Roosevelt is speaking not only in this very symbolic town, but he's also speaking to the veterans of the most violent part of the American Civil War. And he's trying to rally them yet again, not surprisingly, he's trying to rally them around the Union flag. He says, "We come here today to commemorate one of the epoch-making events of the long struggle for the rights of man, the long struggle for the uplift of humanity. Our country, the great republic, means nothing unless it means the triumph of a real democracy, the triumph of popular government." Now, just think about even the language here. The language he's using sounds very much like Crazy Lorenzo Dow, and it sounds very much like John L. O'Sullivan, right? What is the true goal of the republic? To get past Republican forms of government as quickly as possible and lead us to a democracy. In other words, the republic is not the end. It is merely a means. He wants it to end, but not in the Aristotelian sense. He wants it to be over so we can move to this democracy. And in the long run, of an economic system under which each man shall be guaranteed the opportunity to show the best that there is in him. That is why in the history of America, it is now the central feature of the history of the world. For the world has set its face hopefully towards our democracy. And oh, my fellow citizens, each one of you carries on your shoulders not only the burdens of doing well for the sake of your own country, but the burden of doing well and of seeing that this nation does well for the sake of mankind. Now, think about how similar that is, not only to the language of O'Sullivan and also of Crazy Lorenzo Dow, but think about how similar that language is to George Washington in his farewell address. But remember, Washington says we must do well for the sake of heaven's rules, not for the sake of equality, and not for the sake of our democracy, but so that we may be made worthy of the promises of God and his natural law in the economy and course of nature. Right? That's what Washington was talking about. What's amazing about Teddy Roosevelt is that Roosevelt is able to combine all of those languages, the deeply Republican language of Washington, the deeply evangelical language of Crazy Lorenzo Dow, and the language of Manifest Destiny of John L. O'Sullivan, he is able, including then, to bring Lincoln in and combine all of that, and we get something that is purely Teddy Roosevelt, and yet it is so reliant upon so many things that came before Roosevelt. So page 606, the next page. There have been two great crises in our country's history. First, when it was formed, and then again, when it was perpetuated. And in the second of these great crises, in the time of stress and strain which culminated in the Civil War, on the outcome of which depended the justification, let's throw a little Pauline language there, of what had been done earlier, you men of the Grand Army, you men who fought through the Civil War, not only did you justify your generation, that is, not only did you make your generation holy in the sight of God, not only did you render life worth living for our generation, but you justified the wisdom of Washington and Washington's colleagues. If this republic had been founded by them only to be split asunder into fragments when the strain came, then the judgment of the world would have been that Washington's work was not worth doing. So if we merely stopped at what George Washington had wanted, we would never be Washingtonian. Again, everything that Teddy Roosevelt is saying here is that all these things were a progressive means to an end. They were only there to move us from point A to point C. That's it, right? There's no other reason. And the end of history, the triumph of history, is the full equality and democratization of America, which will mean the full equality and democratization of the world. It was you who crowned Washington's work as you carried to achievement the high purpose of Abraham Lincoln. Now, with this second period of our history, the name of John Brown will be forever associated. And Kansas was the theater upon which the first act of the second of our great national life dramas was played. It was the result of the struggle in Kansas, which determined that our country should be in deed as well as in name devoted to both union and freedom, that the great experiment of democratic government on a national scale should succeed and not fail. In name, we had the Declaration of Independence in 1776, but we gave the lie by our acts to the words of the Declaration of 1776. Until 1865. And words count for nothing except insofar as they represent acts. This is true everywhere. First, oh my friends, it should be truest in all political life. A broken promise is bad enough in private life. It is worse in the field of politics. No man is worth his salt in public life. Nice little reference to Matthew there. Who makes on the stump a pledge which he does not keep after election. And if he makes such a pledge and does not keep it, hunt him out of public life. Okay, I like that. That's pretty cool. I care for the great deeds of the past chiefly as spurs to drive us onward in the present. There again is that progressivism. The past is not good enough in and of itself, but only as a means to an end. I speak of the men of the past partly that they may be honored by our praise of them, but more that they may serve as examples for our future. Now, we could get into a very long discussion about his use of John Brown here. John Brown was a murderous, in every way, terrorist, and he was properly executed in 1859 for his crimes against the Republic. Abraham Lincoln in no way supported John Brown and argued that John Brown was as much a violation of the U.S. Constitution in his terrorist acts as were those who seceded from the South. So it's interesting that John Brown has been kind of resurrected here in 1910 as an almost folk hero, because that also fits into the progressivism. That is, John Brown, no matter what his crimes, was in some way advancing the nation towards its progressive end, that is, towards its democracy. And that in and of itself tells us much about what John Brown really does understand and how we understand him. That's really amazing. I'm going to look something up here really quickly, if you guys will forgive me. I probably should have had this up earlier, and maybe I can find it here. It's, you guys have to forgive me. I teach American Civil War, and I absolutely love this stuff. So I want to find John Brown's raid here. This is very interesting. John Brown was supported by a group of New Englanders known as the Secret Six. And one of them, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was actually a really great classical scholar, but crazy when it came to his politics and an abettor of terrorism, was asked after the Civil War about his own role in all of this. And he said, "Why do you want to know of us? Did any historian ever bother to write down the name of the man who bought the donkey on which Christ rode into Jerusalem? We of the Secret Six were as unimportant and incidental to the real story of John Brown as that ancient Judean is to the story of our Lord. We were too often unreliable and all too often too cynical aiders and supporters of a truly great man who deserved better than what he got from us. I am ashamed that we were not more true to our task, as true at least as he was to his. We of the Secret Six are not great men. We do not deserve remembering. Although there was no Judas among us, there were 6 Peters, all of whom denied John Brown at least once through some act or word before the cock crowed. In the end, we were trying to do right, as I believe in the greatest measure, as did do right. The result of the attack on Harper's Ferry was the hastening and inevitable disunion in Civil War. That was good, it was healthy, it was positive. My only perennial wish, however, is that we would have achieved that end without the sacrifice of Brown. I persist in the belief that I, at least, could and should have realized the need to protect John Brown from himself. I should have recognized how incapable he was. I should have perceived the madness that dwelt within him, the insanity that sat stealthily beside his great, selfless nobility. A counter-proposal to this Harper's Ferry scheme should have been made, something that would have both attracted and protected John Brown. In retrospect, I think the bombing of a few fine Southern buildings, or of a few famous Southern men, with notes crediting the blast to some choice Northern abolitionist group, would have done the job. Such action would have brought disunion quickly and without risk to our side. The Russian revolutionists, who were so efficient in making the tyrant Tsar Alexander II explode, have much to teach us about practical terror. Now that reveals a lot about John Brown and about his supporters. And again, I bring all of this up not merely as an interesting detour, but to make the point that the progressives are more than willing to take a terrorist and a murderer, a man who murdered with his battle axe several German, absolutely innocent German immigrants in Kansas, a man who was a murderer, and turn him into this kind of great crux on which all progress depends. Right? That's the really negative side of what we see with someone like Teddy Roosevelt and the progressives. If you look on page 609 in that last full paragraph on the page, we see what Teddy Roosevelt stands for. He calls it a square deal, and he argues that it will be in the spirit of the Union Army. I stand for the square deal. But when I say that I am for the square deal, I mean not merely that I stand for fair play under the present rules of the game, but that I stand for having those rules changed so as to work for a more substantial equality of opportunity and a reward of equally good service. One word of warning, which I think is hardly necessary in Kansas. When I say I want a square deal for the poor man, I do not mean that I want a square deal for the man who remains poor because he has not got the energy to work for himself. If a man who has had a chance will not make good, then he has got to quit. And you men of the Grand Army, that is, those who fought on the Union side in the Civil War, you want justice for the brave men who fought and punishment for the coward who shirked his work. Is that not so? Now, this means that our government, national and state, must be freed from the sinister influence or control of special interests. Sounds good. Exactly as the special interests of cotton and slavery threatened our political integrity before the Civil War, so now the great special business interests too often control and corrupt the men and methods of government for their own profit. We must drive special interests out of politics. Now, there would be two different ways to do this. All right, how would you drive special interests out of politics? Well, number one, you would abolish special interests for those who have them. And therefore, you would level the playing field. No one would receive special interests. But that is not at all what Teddy Roosevelt wants. Teddy Roosevelt wants not more special interest, not fewer special interests, but more of them. If we give Corporation A special interests, then we must give Corporation B and C special interests. So his goal is to level the playing field by giving everybody something rather than by giving nobody nothing. And so his idea of no special interests is actually special interests for all. He tells us, why is this the case? Well, if you look at line 9 on page 610, because he's a true friend of property, he claims. The true conservative is a man who insists that property shall be the servant and not the master of the commonwealth, who insists that the creature of man's making shall be the servant and not the master of the man who made it. So what do we want? Well, he tells us, when we look down to the bottom of page 610, that we want, number one, the oversight of all corporations. Number two, he says we must regulate, not stop corporations. This is incredibly important. The last thing we want to do is hinder enterprise, but we should regulate it and hone it so that it works in our favor. Now, interestingly enough, Teddy Roosevelt makes no argument about what will later be called regulatory capture, and that is special interests will almost always drive out the newcomer to the market because only the old money can afford to pay for certain kinds of regulations and certain kinds of things that are in the market. And often those regulations mimic whatever the large corporations are doing because they're seen as the efficient processes at the time. But that, of course, goes against all market thinking, which argues that it is the entrepreneur and the innovator who comes in and can change the market from below. This Roosevelt doesn't take into account. And of course, what that means is what we have today, not capitalism, but very serious crony capitalism in which the rich keep controlling things in their favor. And number three, he says we must be able to investigate and use the tariff to our benefit. How will we do all of this? Well, if we turn the page on 612, he says we must implement an income tax. And we must have some kind of investment in our financial system is point number 5. Point number 6, he says we must have an extremely strong army and navy, not only something on which we can expend our resources, but in order to claim the markets around the world. And here he's sounding very much like Beveridge and what we read the other day from Beveridge. And finally, number 7, he gives us a proposal that Americans must no longer merely expend their resources, but, as he says at the top of that first full paragraph on page 16, they must learn conservation. That is, they must understand how to preserve the resources that we now have and allow them to work for future generations. When you combine Teddy Roosevelt's love of the American West with his desire to conserve American resources, it's very understandable to see exactly how we could have the kind of national park system, and I credit Teddy Roosevelt greatly with that, but how we end up with the kind of national park system that we have. On page 616, then, he defines all of this. So it's not just the square deal now. He says we need to go beyond the square deal, and instead, we must have what he calls a new nationalism. And this is that first full paragraph on page 616. He says the American people are right in demanding that new nationalism without which we cannot hope to deal with present problems, new problems. The new nationalism puts the national need before sectional or personal advantage. It is impatient of the utter confusion that results from local legislatures attempting to treat national issues as local issues. It is still more impatient of the impotence which springs from over-division of governmental powers, the impotence which makes it possible for local selfishness or for legal cunning, hired by wealthy special interests to bring national activities to a deadlock. The new nationalism regards the executive power, the president, right? It regards the president, not the legislature and not the Supreme Court. It regards the executive power as the steward of the public welfare. In other words, the president becomes the voice of the American people, not the House of Representatives, but the president. And remember, we've just had an amendment passed that makes the Senate popularly elected rather than appointed by the state legislatures. So the new nationalism regards the executive power as the steward of the public welfare. Teddy Roosevelt is really the beginning of all modern understandings of the strong presidency. And we've only had a couple of presidents that have, in ways, countered what Teddy Roosevelt wants. In fact, since Teddy Roosevelt was president, we have only had, well, okay, let's say since Woodrow Wilson was president, we've only had 4 presidents who have not claimed this power as being the voice of the public welfare. Harding, Coolidge, Eisenhower, and Reagan. And Eisenhower and Reagan only to a certain degree, not anywhere near what we would have seen with Harding and Coolidge, but still there to a certain extent. It demands of the judiciary that it shall be interested primarily in human welfare rather than in property, just as it demands that the representative body shall represent all the people rather than any one class or section of the people. So this is the new nationalism. And Teddy Roosevelt says what we need, and he sounds extremely revolutionary here, is a permanent moral awakening in American society. So look on page 617, right there at line 13. The object of government is the welfare of the people. The material progress and prosperity of a nation are desirable chiefly so far as they lead to the moral and material welfare of all good citizens. All right, depending on how we define welfare, that certainly seems constitutional. Just in proportion as the average man and woman are honest, capable of sound judgment, and high ideals, active in public affairs, but first of all sound in their home life, and the father and mother of healthy children whom they bring up well, just so far and no farther we may count our civilization a success. We must have, I believe we already have, a genuine and permanent moral awakening, without which no wisdom of legislation or administration really means anything. And on the other hand, we must try to secure the social and economic legislation, without which any improvement due to purely moral agitation is necessarily evanescent. Let me again illustrate by reference to the Grand Army. You could not have won simply as a disorderly and disorganized mob. You needed generals, you needed careful administration of the most advanced type, and a good commissary. You will remember that success was necessary in many different lines in order to bring about general success. You had to have the administration at Washington good, you had to have had the administration in the field, and you had to have the work of generals good. You could not have triumphed without that administration and leadership, but it would have all been worthless if the average soldier had not had the right stuff in him. Now, all of that is absolutely true about the Civil War, The question is, but one which Teddy Roosevelt has already answered, the question is that the kind of way that we believe a healthy society should be administered? Do we want a healthy society to be administered by these very militaristic means? And Teddy Roosevelt clearly believes that our society must be militarized, that this would be the only really effective way of allowing our republic to transition into a pure democracy, and for that pure democracy to become the general will and the understanding of the new nation. That's radical. I don't care how conservative we think Teddy Roosevelt is. And there were great things to love about Teddy Roosevelt. He was a very good, wholesome, moral person in almost every way. Had a few problems on the question of race, but overall, he was a very good person, especially for his day and age. But do we take these ideas seriously? How willing are we to go to militarize our society? Well, then we get to his almost successor, Woodrow Wilson. There's one president in between, Taft. But we get to Woodrow Wilson, who was elected only because Taft and Roosevelt split the vote in 1912. But Woodrow Wilson is elected in 1912 and becomes president from 1913 up until 1921. I don't want to be only Brad-centric about this, but I do want to state my views. I think Woodrow Wilson is arguably one of the two worst presidents we have ever had. The only person who was worse than Woodrow Wilson was James Buchanan, the president right before Abraham Lincoln. Woodrow Wilson was in every way an uptight moral prig and a tyrant. And we can say this somewhat objectively. Never in our history have we had such a clamping down on civil liberties as we did under Woodrow Wilson during World War I. He never protested against the lynching of blacks. He only reluctantly started protesting against the imprisonment of women who were merely demonstrating to get the vote. And I think, possibly worse of all, he resegregated. In fact, I shouldn't say resegregated because the Navy had never been racially segregated. But he racially segregated the Navy, he resegregated the Army, and he resegregated every bureaucratic office, every federal office in Washington, D.C. He despised blacks in every way, shape, and form. I don't really think we've had a more racist president, even among the slaveholders. I don't think we've had a president who despised blacks more than Woodrow Wilson did. This is a piece of work in every way, and he was very intelligent, but he also was extremely anti-immigrant. He hated Catholics, he hated Jews, he hated blacks, all of these people who might potentially be un-American. As he said, he wanted to yank the hyphen out of hyphenated Americans and homogenize everybody as quickly as possible. And of course, he's almost single-handedly responsible for reshaping the post-World War I world into a modern kind of progressive liberalism that led almost immediately to the reign of communism in Eastern Europe and fascism in Central Europe. And we can say that much of the damage that Woodrow Wilson did at the end of World War I led almost directly to all the problems that led to World War II. And we still live in a very Wilsonian world. Trump's not Wilsonian for the most part, though he's so hard to gauge because it's kind of whatever mood he's in for that day is what policy he determines. But our last four presidents, George Bush, and then Bill Clinton, and then George Bush, and then Barack Obama, they were all Wilsonian in terms of their foreign policy. Turn to the top of page 623, where Wilson outlines what it means to be a progressive. Progress, he says with that exclamation point. Did you ever reflect that the word is almost a new one? No word comes more often or more naturally to the lips of modern man as if the thing it stands for were almost synonymous with life itself. And yet men through many thousand years never talked or thought of progress. They thought in the other direction. Their stories of heroisms and glory were tales of the past. The ancestor wore the heavier armor and carried the larger spear. There were giants in those days. Now all that has altered. We think of the future, not the past, as the more glorious time in comparison with which the present is nothing. The present is nothing. Progress, development, those are modern words. The modern idea is to leave the past and press onward to something new. But what is progress going to do with the past and with the present? How is it going to treat them? With ignominy or with ignominy? Sorry, hard word for me to say. Or respect? Should it break with it altogether or rise out of them, with its roots still deep in the older time? What attitude shall progressives take toward the existing order, towards those institutions of conservatism, the Constitution, the laws, and the courts? Right? These are incredibly important questions, and I will at least give Woodrow Wilson credit. He's willing to engage those questions. So let's turn the page, and he tells us, how are we going to think about the U.S. Constitution? Well, turn down to line 26, or go down to line 26 on 624. The makers of our federal Constitution read Montesquieu with true scientific enthusiasm. They were scientists in their way, the best of their age, those fathers of the nation. Now, that's not exactly true. There were very few scientists among the founding fathers. There was Ben Franklin, there was Benjamin Rush, and there was Thomas Jefferson. That was about it. And you guys, I hope, remember, even though it's been a while, those were the three Enlightenment figures who did have an impact, who played a major role on the founding, but mostly because of their personalities, not because of their ideas. Remember, the founding was much more Republican and it was much more Protestant than it was ever Enlightened. And yet, what aspect of the founding does Woodrow Wilson draw upon? The Enlightenment aspect, that minority position. Jefferson wrote of the laws of nature, and then by afterthought of nature's God. And they constructed a government as they would have constructed an orrery, to display the laws of nature. In other words, the orrery is a model of the solar system. Politics, in their thought, was a variety of mechanics. The Constitution was founded on the law of gravitation. The government was to exist and move by virtue of the efficacy of checks and balances. Now again, every one of you, having taken Western heritage, should know immediately how dead wrong Woodrow Wilson is about this. The checks and balances from the federal Constitution have nothing to do with the science of their age. They have everything to do with the teachings of Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and later Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. That's where the ideas of checks and balances come from. They're not new. They have been deeply rooted in the entirety of the Western tradition. The trouble with the theory is that government is not a machine, but a living thing. It falls not under the theory of the universe, but under the theory of organic life. It is accountable to Darwin, not to Newton. Well, if Woodrow Wilson is correct, and the founding was really based on only Newtonian principles, then he may have an argument. But he's completely wrong. It was not based on Newtonian principles. And therefore, it can't just be based on Darwinian principles. And think about it, even if that were true, Newton at least gave us a center to the universe and the law of gravity that held all things in check by its very nature. But what we have with Darwin, of course, is a never-ceasing evolution. In other words, truth becomes nothing but a moving target, constantly on the run. It is modified by its environment, Wilson continues, necessitated by its tasks, shaped to its functions by the sheer pressure of life. No living thing can have its origins offset against each other as checks and live. On the contrary, its life is dependent upon the quick cooperation, their ready response to the commands of instinct or intelligence, their amicable community of purpose. Government is not a body of blind forces, it is a body of men, with highly differentiated functions, no doubt in our modern day of specialization, with a common task and purpose. Their cooperation is indispensable, their warfare fatal. There can be no successful government without the intimate, instinctive coordination of the organs of life and action. This is not theory, but fact, and displays its force as fact, whatever theories may be thrown across its track. Living political constitutions must be Darwinian in structure and in practice. Society is a living organism and must obey the laws of life, not of mechanics. It must develop. All that progressives ask or desire is permission in an era when development evolution is the scientific word to interpret the Constitution according to the Darwinian principle. All they ask is recognition of the fact that a nation is a living thing and not a machine. Well, once again, what do we become in this idea of Woodrow Wilson? We turn the page and look at the first line of that second full paragraph, line 10 on 626. Well, we are architects in our time, and architects are also engineers. Well, what does that mean? If we interpret the Constitution through Darwinian principles, it means we can ignore totally the Constitution because we have already evolved past it in every way, shape, and form, and therefore there are no fixed principles. Everything merely becomes what is true of the moment. And that is the essence. And Woodrow Wilson even states it. We don't even have to read into it. But that is the essence of progressivism. This desire to move beyond through Darwinian evolution, to move beyond what is fixed and what holds us together. What is it that demands that we, in one way or another, put ourselves together and allow ourselves to understand specifically what that government stands for? We want to be able to move beyond it. Well, we've only got a few minutes left, and we've now covered the progressivism of Teddy Roosevelt and of Woodrow Wilson. So to finish, I want to just talk very quickly. I've got about 8 minutes left. I want to talk very quickly about Pragmatism by William James. Now, I had asked you to read this, and I hope you had a chance to read it. I actually think it is one of the most important and yet one of the most difficult pieces that we have in the entire American Heritage Reader. But now that we've talked about the progressivism of Woodrow Wilson, the pragmatism, which is a subset of progressivism, the pragmatism of William James should become relatively clear, because what he's arguing for is almost identical. It's like 99% overlap with what Woodrow Wilson said. So look to page 591, where he defines what his philosophy of pragmatism is. By the way, we often use practical and pragmatic interchangeably. That is false. Pragmatic is a very specific philosophical term that is based on the idea of truth being a moving target. So he says, pragmatism represents a perfectly familiar attitude in philosophy, the empiricist attitude, right? One of observation. But it represents it, as it seems to me, both in a more traditional and in a less objectionable form than it has ever yet assumed. A pragmatist turns his back resolutely and once for all upon a lot of inveterate habits dear to professional philosophers. He turns away from abstraction and insufficiency, from verbal solutions, from bad a priori reasons, from fixed principles, closed systems, and pretended absolutes and origins. In other words, he has turned away from Aristotle, Cicero, and Thomas Aquinas. Right? That is what James is telling us. He turns towards concreteness and adequacy, towards facts, towards action, towards power. That means the empiricist temper regnant, right? That is, observation made king, and the rationalist temper sincerely given up. It means the open air and possibilities of nature as against dogma, artificially, and the pretense of finality in truth. There is no finality in truth, right? That is a pretense. That is false. At the same time, it does not stand for any special results. It is a method only. And of course, it has to be a method only because truth is a movable object. Don't ever think, as he said, and the way he puts it here, that there is a pretense. Will we ever have a pretense, a belief that there's finality in truth? Absolutely not. And so, what does that mean? Well, he tells us, let's think about our own theology. And he says this on page 595. And look down there at line 18. Old-fashioned theism was bad enough with its notion of God as an exalted monarch, made up of a lot of unintelligible or preposterous attributes. But so long as it held strongly by the argument from design, it kept some touch with concrete realities. Since, however, Darwinism has once and for all displaced design from the minds of the scientific, theism has lost its foothold. So all of our religion was based on a pre-Darwinian understanding. Once Darwin exploded the idea of there being an Adam and Eve, or at least Adam and Eve mattering because we've evolved long beyond them, there is no religion anymore that matters in any real shape or form. So what is truth then? Well, turn to page 599 at the very top there. The moment pragmatism asks the question, it sees the answer. True ideas are those that we can assimilate, validate, corroborate, and verify. False ideas are those we cannot. This is the practical difference it makes to us to have true ideas. That, therefore, is the meaning of truth, for it is all truth that is known as. This thesis is what I have to defend. The truth of an idea is not a stagnant property inherent in it. The deskness of a desk, the humanity of a human. Truth happens to an idea. The desk only matters because it was used for us to sign a document. The truth happened across it. It happened to it. It becomes true, is made true by its events. Its verity, its truth, is in fact an event, a process, the process, namely, of its verifying itself, its verification. Its validity is the process of validation. Look down to line 35 on that same page. The true thought is useful, right? That's what we need. We need an idea to be useful. There must be something that it means. Now notice how radically subjective this idea is. There is no truth inherent in a thing. A truth is only true at a moment because it is useful. And imagine, as he just says, a truth demands assimilation, validation, corroboration, and verification. So think about what we just celebrated. We just celebrated on Easter, this past Sunday, the resurrection of our Lord. Well, imagine if that could only be true if you were able to assimilate it, validate it, corroborate it, and verify it. Anyone among us want to volunteer to be crucified? And we'll see what happens. I mean, this is crazy, but this is pragmatism. Truth is a moving target. There is nothing fixed except for the moment. And already that moment is gone and we're in the next moment, and so forth and so forth and so forth. James is brilliant. Don't get me wrong. He's one of America's greatest philosophers. But that doesn't mean we have to agree with him. If we did agree with James, we would have just abolished the entire core at Hillsdale College. Okay, I know James is hard, and I hope you had a chance to read it, and I hope my explanation here helps. But remember, he is subjective, and he is turning our common notions of truth as being rooted in reality, in eternal reality. Just like Wilson, he is overturning those things. Truth is that which happens to an idea. This is the idea of progress. Okay, so here's what I would like you to do. That is the end of our Wednesday class. For our Friday class, I would like you to read all of the little pieces that we have. I believe that there are 5 of them. I would like you to read the 5 little pieces that we have from Calvin Coolidge. What it means to be a Boy Scout, ordered liberty and world peace, the press under a free government, the reign of law, and the inspiration of the Declaration. Those are all very short pieces. Please read those. And I would also ask you to read the Scopes Trial. For the following class, that is on Monday, I would like you to read the 4 pieces that we have from Franklin Roosevelt. Okay? So I hope that's clear for everybody. Friday, Calvin Coolidge and the Scopes Trial, and for Monday, the 4 pieces that we have from Franklin Roosevelt. All right, everybody, that is our time, and thank you all so much. I hope, again, that you're having a wonderful and blessed Easter week. I miss you guys very, very much. Wish we could hang out, but I hope that these lectures are in some way helping. So until Friday, God bless everybody.